New York U.S. Senate candidate Diane Sare visited Live1.TV studios today and talked about her plans and intentions if she's elected to the U.S. Senate. She also talked about a Middle East solution for peace called the Oasis Plan. Hi everybody, my name's Ian Carpenter. We're in Live1.TV studios in New York with Diane Sare. We're delighted to have her with us. She is running for U.S. Senate here in New York in 2024. Isn't that right?
That's right.
Tell us about your candidacy.
Well, I'm running as an independent. My line on the ballot will say LaRouche or LaRouche Independent. And that's because of my 35 plus years of work with him. And actually what we're about to be discussing is a proposal he outlined in 1975, which drew the wrath of Henry Kissinger, who personally flew to Paris, France, to prevent a diplomatic negotiation, because LaRouche had already been in Iraq meeting with leaders of the Ba'ath Party and met with leaders in the Israeli peace movement and other Arab state representatives. So there was going to be a meeting in Paris to discuss this. The Ba'ath Party of Iraq apparently had agreed to make available, I don't know how much, hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of credit to green the desert. That everyone in the region understands the biggest issue is not petroleum, but water. How do people live? How do you have industry? How can people have decent health care? I mean, everything depends on water. And that's one of the reasons for the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights. And I understand, I don't know how it works, but I heard a Palestinian explaining that the Israelis even control rainwater in terms of what the Palestinians are allowed to have access to. So why not get rid of that bottleneck? Why not do something where people can have a shared mission, a shared benefit, the standard of living massively be raised? What parent says, gee, I'd really like my son or daughter to be living in warfare for 30 years?
No. Yeah. So as a U.S. Senate candidate, it seems important that you've made us aware of some history of Henry Kissinger and Lyndon LaRouche. And what was the advancement that LaRouche brought, or what ideas did he bring forward at that time that you think we should be talking about even today?
Well, perhaps the most important was for Americans, since we've brought that up, and I am running for U.S. Senate. The Senate does have a great deal to do with foreign policy, which is why senators need to know what's going on in the world. But what is the role of the United States supposed to be in the world? Americans tend not to think about that now because we're hurting. We have terrible inflation. Our infrastructure is falling apart. The schools are a disaster. If you say, can you think of any one thing occurring right now where you say, gee, this is going so well. In 50 years, I can't wait to see how good it is. It's hard to, I can't think of anything in the U.S. right. So everything's going in the wrong direction.
Well, that's why we have Hollywood now. Yes, that's right.
Right. So
everything will be fine.
Yeah,
just
yeah,
give it
right,
to the
exactly.
writers.
And I think that's why they have pot dispensaries on every corner, so you can just drown it out, numb your mind, and don't think too hard about it.
Cannabis on every corner? Cannabis stores?
At least.
It is something else here.
It's terrible, and only about, I don't know, 0.5% or fewer of them are legal and have the license. So I mean, that's a whole other thing. The scam, the money laundering, and who runs
tumor
that.
waves also. That's a whole other thing that'll come through as a result of the wonderful care for everyone.
Oh, yeah, that's true. So at any rate, why look at things like the Oasis Plan? Well, the United States was not, it didn't just plop up here because somebody had a piece of land in North America and we existed. There was a conspiracy over centuries. And you can really go back to Joan of Arc and the fight for, say, the First Republic in France. So you can go back to Plato and his dialogue, The Republic. But what were people working on? What were the greatest minds in Europe working on was the question of, if human beings are really created in the image of God, in the image of the Creator, then how can you say that anyone is superior to someone else? What would give somebody the right to rule over everyone else? And Nicholas of Cusa, in the 1400s, when he was trying to keep the Catholic Church from splitting, also wrote a document, Concordantia Catholica. But it's this first document where he raises the question of the consent of the governed. That if it is the case that every human being has this innate divine quality, then what gives someone a right to be a ruler over other people? And he concluded that the only just form of government is that the people must give their consent that someone is going to worry about the cares of the state in order that they may live. So this is a sort of a revolutionary breakthrough. And the founding of the United States was an attempt to get at that. They couldn't do it in Europe because you were stuck in the caste system, right? Everybody could only do what their father and grandfather had done before, and you had baronies, and it just was too hard to get out of it. So the idea was that perhaps in this new land, you could finally come up with a government that was more in keeping with principles of natural law and universal principles. Today, everyone's taught, oh, well, you know, the U.S., it was a bunch of dead white European male slave owners. You know, we weren't perfect, but most of the founding fathers, the most influential ones, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, Gouverneur Morris, John Jay, were vehemently opposed to slavery. And Lincoln's Peoria, Illinois speech, where he talks about, it's a whole thing on the Missouri Compromise, but he makes the point that the principles in our Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And what does he say? That the governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. So Lincoln is making this point, and he says, if that's a universal principle that we hold to be true, then how can you admit of slavery? Because that is a complete contradiction to the principles by which our republic was founded. That's true, and that's what Frederick Douglass also concluded in his very, very, very long speech, which everyone only reads the beginning of, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, where he distinguishes between the imperfections or frailties of the actions of some of the framers of the Constitution and what they intended to bring forth, and the question of universal principle. Now, why was this so important? Because the experiment of the United States was not just for some little select group of people that were going to settle over here. They were saying, we want to make something that's good for mankind. And if our republic is a success, if we demonstrate that people are happy in the Leibnizian sense, that they experience improvements in life expectancy and health and education, all these things, then other nations will want to emulate us. And that we will help other nations to do that, not by running around and beating them with a baseball bat, which would indicate that we weren't living up to our standards.
That's how it sort of turned out.
Yeah, and that's because we became very corrupt and we didn't embody that anymore either. But by trade and other things that help nations to develop. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence that so many nations in Africa began declaring their independence in the 60s with the civil rights movement and the Kennedy presidency. There was hope that perhaps the United States was going to once again embody this mission, so this would be a window of opportunity for nations to finally get their freedom.
Right. But instead, the United States went a different approach, and African nations ended up looking to Cuba and getting some help from Cuba, of all places.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the CIA assassinated a number of very important people,
Yeah.
including our own president.
Seems like such horrible decision making at such a high level.
Well, I think the population is responsible because in our nation, the people have an enormous amount of power. And they chose to tolerate the Warren Commission, which was a cover-up, which everybody knew, but went along with it. And once you do that, you're ceding power to the people that ran the coup.
Yeah. So many things of that era are sort of the Warren Commission and whatnot are sort of steeped in a way, even of the way the news media would talk. And today, the Warren Commission met, and you wondered, could anybody let go of their shoulders and say, well, hey, what about these questions? It seems everything was kind of stiff and like that, and this is the way the news was presented. There's this kind of rhythm to everything that sometimes we didn't get to hear. There were a lot of other stories. Who was the DA down in Louisiana who just tried to get his message across over
Garrison.
and over and over? The DA in Louisiana had a very reasonable voice in the whole conversation, but it seems like, well, I did hear him. I don't know what to say about all these things. I'm mystified by the way the world is going. Tell us about your candidacy. I'm excited about that.
Well, it's interesting. We just came back from the Libertarian State Convention.
Oh.
And I'm very happy that they chose not to nominate a candidate for U.S. Senate, which means that we can collaborate with this outrageous ballot access, the $45,000, more than that, 45,000 signature requirement coming up in April. So by their
So you have 6 weeks to get 45,000 signatures.
Yes.
All right. Is that a lot of work to do? Is that really hard to do? Is it unfair for candidates?
Yes, to all of those, to all of the above. It's nearly impossible. When the requirement was 15,000 signatures, John McCain was unable to do it. He went to court to get on the ballot.
Wow.
So if a guy who's rich and Republican Party backing could not make the requirements, imagine what a person with no party backing, being an independent, or being a minor party like the Libertarian Party or the Green Party. The rules were changed in the budget, the 2019-2020 budget, and it was designed to get rid of any opposition. And I think it was the New York Times that had an article in the 2022 gubernatorial race that it was the first time in, 45 or 50 years that you had only two candidates for governor, a Republican and a Democrat, because the Green Party and the Libertarian Party could not meet the threshold. And these are parties that had been around for decades, that have had dozens, if not, and I think the Libertarians said they had over 107 different elections, local elections that they'd won over their 50 years existence in New York. So these are not frivolous parties, which was the language. We want to keep frivolous candidates off the ballot, so we're going to make it impossible so that only people who will go with the status quo party line are allowed to be on the ballot.
Right.
So I thought that it was an interesting, since I'm not a libertarian and they would not necessarily agree with my platform except for anti-war, free speech, a few not insignificant things, but that we will run on two lines, but there's no conflict in the signature gathering, and I think that's important.
Okay. I don't understand why, but I do get that there's an alignment of the Libertarian Party and your...
In 2022, they ran a Senate candidate, which meant that you're only allowed to sign for one candidate for a given office. So if there were libertarians that wanted to support me, they couldn't circulate their petition and mine because one of the signatures would be disqualified. And therefore, by leaving the line blank, my volunteers, their volunteers can easily circulate both petitions, and there's no conflict, which means in effect that you're able to get double the signatures. So it's just a way of circumventing this attempt to keep, well, they want everyone to be divided anyway and keep people off the ballot.
Yeah, it seems like there are so many things that we need to improve in our elections. I mean, just looking back at the League of Women Voters, how they had this terrific job of holding civic elections and also presidential elections, and then having this phony commission on presidential debates set up by the Republicans and the Democrats who created this phony commission and took this incredible history and legacy of the League of Women Voters away from them. And even the last time I looked on the League of Women Voters website, there was a link to the director during that time, a one-page, her response, and it was it impacted her deeply. She was deeply hurt about how this would affect the whole country. And
well, it has, because it means people aren't capable also of thinking. Everything is a game show. Who knows the answer? Bing, oh, you have 10 seconds.
Right.
You know, in the Lincoln, back to Lincoln again, and Stephen Douglas debates for legislature. The debates were 3 hours long. The opening statement of each was 45 minutes.
Right.
I mean, now, the candidates, well, I've seen politicians who could easily talk for 45 minutes. Everyone would be asleep by the end of that. But the population has no attention span for the development of an idea. So.
Right. I've heard back in the day of Abraham Lincoln that he might even have a wooden box and stand up in a field on a wooden box to, be able to reach a crowd of people who had come to hear him, standing up on a soapbox or maybe a box of any kind.
Right.
So.
Well, you'd have to have an idea. You'd have to actually have a thought if you were going to do that.
Something to say.
Yes.
I mean, something meaningful to say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Now, speaking of that, I want to go back to this Oasis Plan question because people will see the video and say, well, okay, that seems like a good idea, but it'll never happen. These people have been killing each other forever. They're not going to build this, and why should the U.S. be involved in it? And there's a couple of things I want to say to that. One is, people underestimate the power of an idea. That the way ideas work, it's not a pairwise linear, those hanging things with the metal balls and you bounce one on the end and the one on the other?
Yes.
Right?
Right.
The way ideas change history is not a kinetic physics bouncing ball machine, ball knocking machine. They begin to take on a life of their own. And they come out, for example, in 1988, Lyndon LaRouche, who was on trial, about to go to jail, went to Berlin and gave a press conference where he said the Soviet Union is going to disintegrate, the economy is terrible, I'm running for president of the United States. As president, I would like to propose that the United States will feed Poland in return for the reunification of Germany. Now, his wife is German, and she thought, this is a nice idea, but it's never going to happen, having grown up with the Berlin Wall. But he very authoritatively stated this, called for this. November 1989, he's sitting in prison, and the Berlin Wall comes down. He further, in that 88 speech, said that Berlin is once again going to be the capital of a reunified Germany. And so when the reunification was completed then in 1990, Berlin was reestablished as the capital. So how does that work? And I think it's not a thing you can put your hands on. You can't weigh it in a scale. You can't say, oh, there it is, that's what caused it. But you put something into the domain of human thought, and it, in a way, creates a direction for mankind to move. And that's why I'm so concerned about the collapse that we're in, because we are at the end of an epoch. We really are. Will mankind take advantage of it to move with the very biggest, boldest, best ideas? Or are we so beaten down that we're just going to look up from our little hovel and say, well, could I get 3 crumbs? And not take the whole thing. So in a moment like this, then you say, well, what would be the best? What can we do here? We have the 1967 UN Resolution 242. That's the last expression of international law on this region. The last expression of international law was the 2 states, Palestine, Israel, the 1967 borders. So if you want to take a starting point, because I know there are all kinds of one-state proposals floating around involving Israel becoming a secular state and giving the Arabs equal rights. After this, I find it hard to imagine happening. But since you have international law, you have the 2 states, then you start with that and you say, okay, now how do we make this viable? How can we guarantee that this will last? And there are certain thorny things like getting the settlers to move out of the West Bank, which I think has to be done. It's illegal. We shouldn't be selling land over there anymore. It's like by putting a for sale sign on your house and going to sell it to someone else. It's pretty amazing. But anyway, so you deal with that, but what's the benefit to everyone? We say, guess what? We're going to green the desert. Guess what? All the Palestinian children are going to have a chance to discuss what the new cities of Gaza are going to look like. How much do you think there should be building limits? Do you think we should have museums? Should we have concert halls? Should we have a robust fishing industry? Can we desalinate the seawater? There's a discussion in the plan, as you know, because the Dead Sea is 400 meters below sea level. So if you build canals, not for transportation and shipping, you have the Suez Canal, but for irrigation, and you're moving water into the Dead Sea, that's a huge drop. That's hydroelectric power. So if you say, look, we're going to have abundant water, abundant energy, we're going to rebuild this region with totally modern architecture, and both sides you will have security guarantees, because the United States is going to be stop being a fascist, arrogant dictatorship, and collaborate with Russia and China. If you have Russia and China and the US on the same page, and they say Israel and Palestine side by side, and you are not going to harm each other, they can enforce that. And we have to think that way. We have to move to that, because it's simply not adequate. If you say a ceasefire, then what? I mean, there should be a ceasefire. Don't get me wrong. We have to have a ceasefire. But where, to what end? And that's why it's so important to put this idea of the Oasis Plan out there first. And I have a very strong opinion that if the United States would be involved in such an endeavor to green the deserts, to create peace in this region, the entire cultural dynamic in the United States would shift. It would shift from pessimism to optimism, because people would see something that they thought never could be solved having a potential for a solution, and it would change the way they look at everything. So you'd look at Jackson, Mississippi, which has horrific water problems, and we'd say, well, this is stupid. If we can green the deserts of Gaza, if we can have Palestine and Israel live side by side with abundant fresh water and electricity, we can't fix Jackson, Mississippi. We can't fix the Bronx, right? In other words, it's not, you don't even need the actual physical development to occur. It's the idea. The idea comes first, and once people have a vision that this can be done, then it creates the path for the action.
Right. That's what I thought, and that's why that's what I like about the idea myself too, about the Oasis plan. Somebody does have an inclusive plan for the important regions in the Middle East. We call it the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And because the East Coast of the United States and New York is so interested and involved in those areas, we have big Jewish populations here. So I think that's what attracted me, honestly, to hearing the idea of the Oasis plan. I had other ideas about how it actually gets implemented, but it's the first time anybody's ever spoken about an inclusive plan of prosperity. I've never even heard that kind of conversation regarding the conflict there, which I've heard described as a real estate dispute, which is pretty trite compared to the seriousness of what's going on. But well, that's great. Is there anything more about the Oasis plan that you want to talk about right now? And we do have the 15-minute video where people can get a little more in-depth understanding of what the Oasis plan is.
Well, one other aspect of this is whenever you embark on a bold initiative, there are new technologies, new things that you discover. I mean, every part of the earth has unique properties of terrain, like the incredible salt content in the Dead Sea, right?
Right. Tell me about that, because I'm just right now understanding. So the Dead Sea has a tremendous drop in its elevation.
Right.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah. It evaporated. So it was a sea which evaporated. And so it left, not only was it salty, but now it's super salty. Maybe, I don't know, in comparison to Salt Lake in Utah, but it's very, very salty.
Right.
So that's why also desalination becomes a big deal. And also, I don't know, I imagine they mine a lot of that right now, the salts, the minerals. It's probably very rich in certain kinds of minerals. I'm not an expert on it, but I'm just saying, when you begin to do something where you're interacting with the earth, you discover certain properties, you discover certain techniques that have applications elsewhere, and again, it creates a kind of optimism. Because what's more depressing than saying, like the environmentalist movement, right? Well, we know everything about the world and you're polluting it, so just stop exhaling and don't think about creative solutions to any of this. There's nothing new to discover. That's depressing. Then what's the point of being here?
So you don't think that Johann Sebastian Bach discovered every single chord possibility, that there's still hope for new composers?
Yes.
Can I make a quantum leap with where this is going?
Absolutely.
Because some people say, all songs have been written already. All the songs have been... No?
That's crazy.
Really?
That's like saying all colors exist.
Okay.
Why are color ranges infinite? Because you can have infinitely small, and the potential of... We'll take the well-tempered scale with, 12 pitches. People say, well, isn't that already limiting? Well, no, because not only do you have I hate to use the word sound, because music isn't really in sound. It's in the relationships, right? But time has an infinite array of possibilities. It's limitless. And that is, again, something really exciting. So no, we haven't done everything. It would be impossible to do everything even, which is another miracle of the universe.
Diane, your ideas for the U.S. Senate don't sound like the usual type of ideas you hear in New York State.
I know, isn't that unfortunate?
No, I think it's fortunate. I'm really glad to hear them. So there's only a few months left until November, and what can we look for in your campaign, and what are going to be some milestones, and when does the signature process
Well, the
start?
petitioning begins April 16th, and if there's anyone out there who wants to help get me on the ballot, please send me an email. We need all hands on deck. It's a very tough, it's April 16th to May 28th is the last filing day, but New York, as you can imagine, has all these picky little detailed laws, so we need at least 1 week to put all the petitions together, put them in the right order, clean them up, which really brings you down to 5 weeks. And I would prefer if we get the bulk of the signatures gathered earlier. So that's one major hurdle, is getting on the ballot. Then we'll have a big, I don't know, I suddenly had this image of Evel Knievel on the motorcycle looping over these things.
Once we make that great divide.
Is to get them to have a debate. Schumer excluded me from the debate last time. He did have one debate with Joe Pinion, who I called No Pinion because he had no opinion. He agreed with Schumer on the Ukraine-Russia war, for example. So what's the point of running? And so therefore it was a safe debate because nothing would be brought up because they wholeheartedly agreed with each other. And even though I had made the threshold of the 45,000 signatures, which was to demonstrate that I was not a frivolous candidate, I was not unfrivolous enough to be included in the debate.
Wow. Yeah, so in New Yorkers, if you're out there, so Diane, how do people help out if they're interested in helping out your campaign?
They should visit my website, sareforsenate.com, and it's not the number, it's the word, sareforsenate.com.
Right.
People can sign up and donate. I need funds.
Funds too?
I have no money from big corporations.
Okay.
I have no super PAC.
Well, then maybe somebody watching this will be able to get involved. And if they're not, maybe they can physically put some time into it also. It must be a lot of administrative work to get these signatures in such a short time. Do you have that all set up? Is that the type of stuff that...
We're working on it. We need more volunteers. We had last go round when I managed to succeed at doing this, we had about 200 volunteers of different, maybe a hardcore of 80 people who did a lot of the petitioning and also what we call clerking. We had a team at night reviewing the signatures, checking the validity rates, looking for problems, working with our petitioners in the field if someone was doing something that was sloppy or was missing something, getting that corrected. It is a big job. It has many different
And can people reach out to your campaign and say, hey, I want to sign that petition too? So they reach out to you, or do you reach out to them in the field?
Well, they certainly can. They certainly can.
Say, I want to support Diane Sare being on the ballot, and I want to hear her in the debates. And I'll make up who I'm deciding for on the election day. But,
exactly. And that should be very clear. Signing a nominating petition does not obligate you to vote for that person or any person.
Yeah. Well, that's terrific. So we hope the people watching will watch the video. We're going to put a link, and maybe we can run it at the end of this interview. We'll have it come up right afterwards. And Diane, why don't you have the last word, and we will follow your campaign.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
I would urge everybody to be active and pessimism comes from yourself. It's not an external factor. If you determine that you are going to fight and never give up, you will discover that you suddenly feel more optimistic than you felt before. What causes pessimism is deciding to give up.
The whole world is witness to the horrors being inflicted upon the Palestinian people, shared with us every day in video form. But the destruction continues, actively supported by the United States and a diminishing number of other countries. Humanity's moral fitness to survive is being tested. The horror show must end, starting with an immediate, unconditional ceasefire. At the time we're recording, South Africa's action against Israel for genocide at the International Court of Justice will be heard in just a few days. Peace is possible, but it is not the peace of a return to October 6th. Before the Hamas invasion of October 7th, the Palestinian people and the entire region, popularly known as the Middle East, were living in a terrible reality, a cauldron of conflict deliberately maintained for geopolitical aims, an unsustainable and unjust tension. The solution requires the recognition of a Palestinian state, in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 242, which was unanimously adopted by the Security Council in 1967. This would be the first step towards a long-term solution, such as the two-state solution supported by Schiller Institute founder Helga Zepp-LaRouche. The solution, though, it's not local, it's not regional, it has to be international today. China has proposed an international peace conference to develop a lasting vision for realizing Palestinian, Israeli, and Arab-Israeli peace. The mistakes that led to the lost chance of the 1993 Oslo Agreement must not be repeated. Security guarantees for all parties in the region must be agreed upon, and this includes finding solutions for the potentially explosive situations elsewhere in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and Sudan. All products of decades of dangerous geopolitics. But without economic development, without a viable and meaningful path of progress into the future, political agreements in themselves are unsustainable. The people of the region must know that their children will enjoy a better future, a better life. Peace through economic development is the only successful basis for a lasting, just peace in the region. This is what Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin came to realize. There is no purely military basis for peace or security. Development is essential. A template for peace through economic development already exists in the form of the LaRouche program of building a world land bridge, today exemplified by China's Belt and Road Initiative, joined by more than 150 nations, including all the neighbors of Palestine and Israel. This is not only a specific plan for growth through particular projects, it is a rejection of anti-growth hegemonism in the form of neocolonialism and green Malthusianism. A strong economic and reconstruction and development plan is needed for a viable Palestinian state in particular. Lyndon LaRouche laid it out 30 years ago. It is called the Oasis Plan. Immediately after the 1993 signing of the Oslo Accord in the White House by Israeli and Palestinian leaders, Lyndon LaRouche and his associates urged those parties and the international community to implement economic development projects to advance the peace process. LaRouche and his associates developed the Oasis Plan, which included both certain economic aspects of Annex 4 of the 1993 Oslo Accord, which was called the Protocol on Israeli-Palestinian Cooperation Concerning Regional Development Programs. Plus, it called for additional crucial water, power, and other projects that LaRouche noted were needed in the mid-1970s. This plan, the Oasis Plan, focused primarily on addressing the greatest barrier to development in the region, the shortage of fresh water, through the construction of a network of desalination plants that could turn the plentiful seawater into fresh water. And these plants would not only be on the Mediterranean coast, they would be built along two new canals, one connecting the Red Sea with the Dead Sea, and another connecting it to the Mediterranean. To be clear, these new canals or aqueducts are not for cargo shipping, as an alternative to the Suez Canal. Their purpose is to transport water. Now, because of the low elevation of the Dead Sea, which is more than 400 meters below sea level, the flowing water could also provide hydropower, electricity along the way, which could help power the desalination plants and development more generally. The plants could also be powered by the large quantities of natural gas off the shores of Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. But most importantly, the Oasis Plan calls for going beyond hydropower and chemical fuels altogether, through the construction of nuclear power complexes along these canals and on the shores of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, to produce plentiful electricity and to desalinate seawater to green the vast deserts of the region and to power an industrialization process in Palestine, in Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt. The use of nuclear power for energy would liberate the region's hydrocarbon resources to be used chemically to produce industrial materials through intermediate petrochemical products. The nuclear-powered complexes could use inherently safe, pebble-bed, high-temperature gas-cooled reactors of the type just brought into operation in Shidao Bay, China. The new man-made rivers created by desalination will tremendously expand the potential for agricultural and industrial development across the region, making the deserts and the economies bloom. LaRouche explained the necessity of developing new sources of water in a 1994 speech. LaRouche: one cannot meet the indices of water consumption for a modern population, for both the Palestinian and Israeli populations, under present conditions. There is a conflict over water because the Israelis have, frankly, been using their conquests to take water from everybody. It's one of the conflicts with Syria on the Golan Heights issue. It involves in Lebanon the Litani River and things of that sort. So the power and water development have to be accompanied by a network of transportation infrastructure, upgrading the physical connectivity between all the nations of the region, turning a region of conflict, a barrier to connectivity, into a hub of interaction, into a crossroads. A highway connecting the West Bank with the Gaza Strip, linking the Palestinian state, is an absolutely essential feature of this network. Regional highways and rail networks will allow the entire area to operate from a higher economic platform. LaRouche also proposed an expansion of the Suez Canal, with industrial zones to be built on both sides, a task that has been accomplished by Egypt in recent years. LaRouche argued since 1975 that this region, which is the crossroads of civilization and located geographically between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, and between Europe, Asia, and Africa, that it has a unique position as an industrial and logistics hub. Oil and natural gas will be feedstocks for industrial production of plastics, paints, many other useful materials, rather than being exported as a raw material to be used primarily for simple combustion. The upgrading of connectivity to enable higher levels of development has been a key feature of the 2013 China-proposed Belt and Road Initiative. Using this region as a land bridge between continents, with the major powers like the US, China, Russia, and the EU contributing to its development, will stabilize the area and, along the way, help cement the better relations among the superpowers that will have been necessary to bring it into being. Scientific, technological, and cultural cooperation and exchanges are key elements in the transformative process the Oasis Plan represents. By cooperating to fight the desert, rather than each other, the people of the region will better be able to recognize the humanity in each other, the common capability of human beings to discover principles of nature and to transform our relationship to the environment around us. There are no human animals. So, how will we pay for all this, and who's paying? Part of the funding will come from financial aid, made more possible by beating swords into plowshares, by converting the industrial and research capabilities of the military financial complex into productive uses, as detailed in a study by Executive Intelligence Review. Apart from international aid, $100 billion of credit can be realized over a decade for the reconstruction of the Palestinian areas and the full building out of the Oasis Plan infrastructure. This can be organized through development banks associated with the BRICS Plus nations, including the Islamic Development Bank in Saudi Arabia, the New Development Bank headquartered in China, and other national development banks of the Southwest Asia region. The sovereign wealth funds of the major regional BRICS Plus nations can help capitalize these development banks for this purpose. The countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council have sovereign wealth funds holding some $4 trillion worth of capital. This has traditionally been placed in financial, banking, or real estate assets in the collapsing transatlantic sector. And now these countries are looking for more productive investments instead in Eurasia and Africa. This investment can be concessionary development loans from these banks. For example, 20 years duration, interest rates of 2%, and an initial grace period of 5 years if necessary. The debt service payments on these development loans, at least if they're made in the immediate future, would have to be made by the State of Israel, as the state currently occupying and taxing the entire area of Israel and Palestine today. The United States, and perhaps other nations, as determined at an International Peace and Development Conference, would be the guarantors of these debt service payments. The organization of this reconstruction work and the building of the Oasis Plan infrastructure could be organized under the authority of the UN Peacekeeping Mission's Military Logistics Unit and the UN Relief and Works Agency for Refugees in Palestine, and any other authorities that are required. These arrangements should all be formally agreed upon by the nations involved in the framework of an international peace conference on Israel and Palestine, which must urgently be organized. International commitments to development, both through these particular projects and as a paradigm, must be made. Achieving peace in Southwest Asia, not only between Israelis and Palestinians, but among all the countries of the entire region, will mark a new epoch in human history, as a region known for conflict transforms into one of connectivity, standing at the crossroads of 3 continents. The Oasis Plan is not some distant aspiration of what can be achieved in the future after peace. It is only through a paradigm of international relations supporting this approach that peace is even possible. An end to the killing, a ceasefire, is urgently needed now. But just as urgently is needed a vision for a durable peace that will, at long last, shape a peaceful and prosperous destiny for the region. Every minute the war continues brings more death, more bitterness, more difficulty in achieving shared prosperity. It must end now. Justice for those who have died, those who have been injured, those who have suffered, demands that the awful violence awaken the conscience and intellect of the international community, not simply to say never again, but to end forever the geopolitical paradigm that is the origin of most conflict in the world today. The Oasis Plan cannot today be implemented as a purely regional plan. A new security and development architecture is required globally. The voices of the Global South are becoming stronger and more confident. Moral authority, now and in the future, depends on how we act today. LaRouche wrote in 1978, "The only human thing is to give the lives and suffering of the dead meaning, not merely by establishing peace in the Middle East, but by establishing the basis for peace, which gives fulfillment to the lives of the present and future generations of the Palestinians and other Arabs, and thus purpose and fulfillment to the sacred lives of the dead." This applies to the Israelis as well. How about you? Will you act to give meaning to the lives of those who have perished? Will you be a voice for peace and development?